Edward's awakening was painful. The fog of illusory vision melted away, dripping pain down his temples, giving way to reality. Cruel, roaring silence that pierced his brain with shards of cold, dead glass. He opened his eyes. Everything was as before. The same walls he had stared at before the blackout, the same stone floor he had fallen onto, splitting his brow open and bleeding. The painful loss of consciousness had been a forced measure by his exhausted body. The tension that had accompanied him all these days, it felt like years, pushed his mind to the brink of madness, beyond which lay the solace of insanity. But in his case, madness would not be a salvation. Deep down, he knew that even if he lost his mind, he would continue to see them. It had gone too far. Everyone makes mistakes and everyone pays for them. His presence here, on the cold, moldy floor of an abandoned church, voluntarily locked in, alone, was merely an escape from those who had come to collect the debt for his past sins. Lord, have mercy on those who have erred, who have killed not for protection but for sustenance, those who did not value what they had. No one is without sin, and in this we are equal, the hermit monk and the werewolf whose claws and teeth are stained with blood. Spare us. Let the reckoning come after death. Why now, while I still live? Outside the stone walls of the small church, wolves howled. They whimpered, fought, scratched at the doors. They barked in fits of hungry spasms and convulsions. Then they grew quiet. He heard them digging in the ground. He hoped they would reach him and tear him apart. He couldn't bring himself to end his own life. But his hopes were not to be realized. The wolves were merely digging up graves to feast on the dead human flesh, gnawing it with savage delight under the full moon's light. He rose from the floor. He listened. They weren't there yet. God, how he wished they would never be there again. His name was Edward Foster. That was in a past life, and even then few called him by that name. By his nature, no one was supposed to know his name. People called him and addressed him without names. They simply said, "There's a job," or "We need to meet." And he would come, always to the same place, a quiet, unremarkable restaurant on the corner of 48th Street, where Big Joe sat, invariably with a stinking cigar in his mouth, smoking like a chimney and drinking warm whiskey. And he would sit opposite, without greeting or making foolish comments about how wonderful the day was. He would silently look at the photograph, not asking unnecessary questions. Joe himself said only what needed to be known. Extra information played a bad joke in their line of work. How many of those fatal photographs had he seen? Dozens? Hundreds? He didn't keep count. The only thing to count was the money Joe brought, because even though Joe was an old partner, he often shorted the needed amount by 100 or two. Yes, I was a killer, a hitman. The statues and frescoes looked down at him. Edward leapt at one depicting an old man, raised his fist, but stopped. How foolish it was to fight with stone saints. Yes, I was a killer, Edward whispered again. But I am also a werewolf. I need food, and this idea seemed perfect to me long ago. I eliminate for money and destroy the victims without leaving a trace. But now, whose church was this? Catholic? Protestant? Edward didn't know. For as long as he could remember, he had never entered a church. He thought those who wasted precious time on meaningless chatter with God were fools. You might as well talk to a chair or a wall, they wouldn't hear you either. That's what he thought then. And now, here he was, sitting by a statue. What difference does it make who to believe in, the devil or God, as long as it saves from them? Lord, I am a werewolf. Can you hear me? Wasn't it you who cursed me? But I don't want this anymore. I'm tired. I don't want to be a hitman or a monster anymore. The statue looked at him and frowned. And Edward looked at the old man and couldn't take his eyes off him. A gray old man with ash-covered eyes, holding a book. Damnation. The old man pierced him with his gaze, cutting into his heart, penetrating his very soul. The heavy look ground him in its millstones, and Edward couldn't hold back. He grabbed his head and began to sob. It became easier. How ironic. "I'm seeking refuge from the dead in a church," he whispered. Edward picked up a stone lying on the floor, a piece of plaster, and hurled it at the church ceiling. "I don't believe in God. I don't want to believe in him." He screamed again, started punching the walls. Then he calmed down, slid to the dusty floor like a piece of wet paint. "Joe, that fat bastard. It's his fault. He's the one who called me every time saying we needed to meet. And then he'd pull a photo out of his pocket and I'd look at it, memorizing. The face mattered. Names, addresses, habits. They were all secondary. The face. It's what I had to remember. By the face, you can determine all a person's habits. I'd look and already know that this one, he's a big company owner, he has a mistress, and he's a collector. And this one, he's sloppy, he doesn't care about anything but himself and the perversions he loves. And so on. And the last one was a doctor. I figured that out too. Doctors have faces like old books. Behind an unassuming cover are many words, clever, specific. It's hard to explain in words. You can only feel it. It's my monster nature. I feel and see through people. And I would transform into my beastly form and wander the city. Just wander. With the victim's portrait in front of my eyes. 2, 3 days, sometimes a week, and I'd find him. Joe rarely gave me the victim's address, only when the job needed to be done quickly. Mostly I acted this way. But there were exceptions. Sometimes I had to run myself. But I always completed the job. I'd been shot more than once. 2 bullet wounds on my left leg, a scar on my right arm. The victim's security, a hole in my side. From a silver knife, fools thinking they could kill a werewolf with a silver knife. But something always helped me, and I survived. And after all I've seen and done, I'm supposed to believe in God. I am my own God. Only I can help myself, and no one else cares about me but myself. The wolves howled again outside, whimpering and wheezing. "And I am one of them," Edward whispered, suddenly enlightened. "I am a wolf, cleaning up the rotten meat in society. Every one of those I killed was like a rotting piece of meat. They spread disease. They preyed on ordinary people, wallowed in vice. I am a surgeon, excising a tumor. Henry, I remember that bastard. I called him that, another victim. But I didn't know his real name, nor did I want to. He looked like a gnawed cat's spine. Joe ordered him last winter. I immediately understood from the photograph, from his shiny pink baby-like face, that he was one of those, sick in the head. Tracking him down wasn't difficult. People of that type think alike. Edward turned towards the clerestory window, wanting to walk to the cobweb-covered altar, but he couldn't. His legs, losing control, stumbled over each other, and Edward collapsed to the floor. The last thing that flashed through his mind before he sank into the twilight of unconsciousness was, "Lizzie, I tried to kill her quickly to spare her pain." It all started with a cold. His bones ached, a fever set in. Before, he never noticed any tendency towards illness. Monsters had good immunity. But lately he had felt unwell. Perhaps the body's boundless reserves were running out. And this last job knocked him out of his groove. A young girl whom he... Why did he take on this job at all? Yes, they paid 3 times more. But didn't he already have money? What was the real reason? To kill the girl? This was the first time for him. maybe to test himself, to probe that boundary he couldn't cross. He completed the task, cold-bloodedly, as was expected. But 2 days later, he fell ill. And that's when he first heard the voices. Edward lay on the couch, flipping through the TV channels. His head was spinning from the strong painkillers mixed with fever reducers. The screen, from frequent switching, turned into a bizarre color whirl. Snatched words from previous channels overlaid images from others, creating nonsense worse than soap operas. Turning off the TV, Edward tried to sleep, but he couldn't. Something called to him. Edward opened his eyes. Had he dozed off? He listened. Silence. He didn't have his own home. It was safer that way. From time to time, he changed motels, staying in each no more than a month. In some, he stayed a week. In others, he lingered longer. His last refuge was the Mouse House, named either for its gray color, in which everything here was painted, from the walls and ceiling to the night lamps, or because in every room mouse holes were visible in the corners, and at night the rustling and squeaking of the little creatures were all-encompassing and drove him crazy. But Edward didn't complain. The motel was on the edge of the city and was the kind of hole where people came only for one night, to spend the night on a journey or to spend it with a prostitute bought right there. Against the background of constantly changing faces, he was unnoticed, and no one tried to delve into his life. Edward. The voice again. Edward got up. Was the voice coming from the bathroom? It was hard to tell. His head buzzed from the fever. Edward? It repeated. Definitely from the bathroom. Edward went into the bathroom, looked around. No one. He pressed his ear to the wall. Maybe neighbors in another room were calling him. Edward! The voice now came not from the bathroom, from the room. Edward stepped out. He unsheathed his claws, partially transforming into a werewolf. Who are you? He asked the emptiness. You know me. Edward turned sharply. The voice seemed to be playing with him. It sounded from different places. Where are you? Edward whispered, tensing and expecting the voice to come from somewhere. The wall, the voice moaned. Is this some prank by Big Joe? Edward thought. Tony, I'll rip your throat out. Know that I don't like being played with. Where did you hide the microphone? Or whatever you have? You're funny. Joe, is he your friend? We know nothing about him. Come out. I'm counting to 3. We can't come out. We're in the wall. In the wall? Edward looked at the walls. The wall near your blood. We are there. You better be packing your things right now and getting far away. Otherwise, I'll find you and tear you apart, Edward thought, approaching the wall. Where are you hiding the microphone? We're in the wall. Edward tapped his claws on the partition. A hollow echo rolled to the floor. A stronger blow punched a hole in it. Edward began tearing off the drywall, throwing it aside, looking for what was making the sound and mocking him. Free us. I'll cut your ears off, filthy scum. Are you playing with me? Tired of living? Free us, the voice full of pain and suffering repeated. The rising dust got into his eyes and nose, making him want to sneeze. The disfigured room now looked more like the abode of a giant rat than a person. Opposite the doors in the wall was a hollowed-out hole, as if meant for a mutant rodent from 1950s horror films, which Edward watched with relish as a child. Edward stepped aside, letting the construction dust settle. Where are you? He asked, peering into the haze. Here, look. And through the dusty veil, Edward saw who owned the voice. A human corpse was walled up in the wall. His bluish-white skin, cloudy eyes covered with plaster dust, and dead, dry hair falling onto his forehead. All this caught Edward's eye and scorched his mind. Edward opened his mouth in surprise. It was not so much the fact that there was a corpse in his room wall that surprised him, but that Edward knew him. Brad. The owner of a small shop and somehow connected to the mafia and slipped up on something. Edward was ordered to kill him 6 months ago. He slit his throat with his claws, forever silencing his restless nature. "What the—" "I have returned to you," Brad said, stepping out of the hole in the wall. "I am now part of you. You ate me." Edward fully transformed into a werewolf and ferociously attacked the corpse. He slashed at it, struck with all his might. Brad looked at the claw marks on his belly, glanced at Edward, and burst out laughing. The werewolf, on the contrary, saw nothing funny in it. "I have surprises for you." The dead man pointed a finger at the opposite wall. Edward turned, but kept Brad in his peripheral vision. People slowly emerged from the wall Brad pointed to, and they were all familiar. Edward swallowed a lump that had risen to his throat. His dead. Those he had killed. I fell asleep by the TV, flashed through his mind. They're probably showing something creepy on TV and I'm asleep, and it seems... A powerful punch to the jaw snapped Edward out of his stupor. Brad possessed incredible strength. Even a werewolf was no match for him. Rising from the floor and spitting out bloody saliva, Edward darted to the opposite wall. "Come to us!" the dead yelled, slowly surrounding him in a tight, foul-smelling ring. The werewolf began striking those corpses that came too close. The dead only laughed from the wounds they received, as if instead of claws, Edward had a goose feather with which he tickled the rotting sides of the corpses. And this angered Edward. He shoved one of the dead away and tried to break through the ring surrounding him. A foul smell of decay hit his nose. The guests did not let him go. They grabbed his hands and legs and dragged him to the hole from which Brad had appeared. Edward had never had to call for help, and now he hesitated until they squeezed him into the narrow passage and began sealing the hole with something sticky, smelly, like thickened oil spewed from the mouths of the corpses. "Hey! Help! Someone hear me! Help!" Edward shouted. Until the last moment, he hoped it was just a nightmare brought on by the drugs. But the dead acted quickly, and in an instant, the hole in the wall was almost completely sealed. Only Edward's head peered out into the room. Edward tried to tear this thickening, viscous substance apart, but only scratched his paws on the embedded sharp stones. Feeling them with his palm, he realized in horror that they were pieces of someone's teeth. The dead moved back, watching as if a brigade of workers inspecting their completed task. There was a knock at the door. "Are you all right in there?" asked someone. Edward recognized the manager's voice. The dead turned towards the knocks, then began approaching the wall next to Edward and dissolving, leaving damp spots that smelled of mold and dampness on the gray wallpaper. The last one to leave Edward's room was Brad. "We will return," he promised with a smile. And he vanished. And along with him, the sticky substance holding Edward disappeared. Edward stood in the gaping hole in the wall, like in an elevator, clutching the void with his bloodied fingers. A second ago, it had been a piece of goo. "Hey, are you okay?" The knock came again. Seems like not, Edward thought. He transformed back into a human as he approached the door, opening the door just enough to stick his head through, and with a trembling voice and stumbling words, he explained that everything was fine. He just had a bad dream. The manager looked at Edward with suspicion. "I heard a lot of loud noise and animal growls. Do you have pets in there?" "It was the TV." Edward laughed nervously. "Volume was on max. Everything is fine, thanks for checking." And Edward shut the door. The sound of the manager's retreating steps calmed him, but only for a while, until he heard behind him again, "We will return." Edward turned sharply, almost twisting his neck, but saw no one. The room was empty. His head, on the other hand, was bursting with thoughts. The next morning, after a sleepless night, they returned again. A hissing sound like a red-hot brand searing and peeling flesh from bare bone echoed near his ear. "The wind brings oblivion, my friend. We just need to conquer our fear," a quiet voice said. "The wind brings oblivion, my friend. We just need to conquer our fear," another voice repeated. And everything spun in a mad dance of insanity. Voices, there were no fewer than 1,000, screamed, whispered, moaned the same lines, merging into a stormy squall. Edward covered his ears, but it didn't help. Sharp needles of madness pierced his brain, and it felt like his head would explode from the gravel of words filling it. "Enough! Stop it!" the man shouted, contorting in pain. Minutes stretched like drying tar, then stopped altogether, were torture for Edward. The voices drove him insane, as if an axe was splitting his head, making him rush from corner to corner. Then night fell, bringing no respite. What happened in the morning seemed like child's play compared to what unfolded before him now. To the voices were added visual hallucinations. Or were they not hallucinations at all? The dead floated out of the walls, walked around him, then pounced, tore at him, scratched out his eyes, ripped out his hair, sank their teeth into his body. Pain wasn't as terrifying a punishment compared to their eyes, which drilled into him, penetrated his soul, and there, like worms, gnawed tunnels to his spine and up to his brain. Madness throbbed in his temples, ready to burst through the thin partition of his skull. And then he couldn't take it anymore. He ran out of the house without looking back, through the deserted pre-dawn streets, past empty gas stations and trash cans. The wind whistled in his ears, and his entire body was chilled by the drafts, but he didn't notice. Running was the only escape from this nightmare. Then the urban landscape began to dissolve into natural scenery. Trees and bushes started to appear. Houses and cars disappeared. Somewhere behind him the road turned off. The voices stayed behind there as well. Edward stopped. He listened. It was quiet, but only for a moment. Familiar ghostly words echoed distantly, and the man realized that he could not escape. They would catch up with him. Panic enveloped him, and he rushed up the hill, past the old abandoned cemetery, to the place where a dilapidated, time-worn church stood. "Lizzie? We have returned," said a young girl standing in the middle of the hall. Her face, white as if sculpted from plaster, stared at Edward. In the corner of her mouth a trickle of dried blood. Her neck, slightly askew, crunched when she turned her head. Edward shivered. "We?" "All those you killed," she explained. The girl smiled, and there was nothing alive in that smile. They had returned. The dead who had been chasing him had retreated for a while when he took refuge in the church. But even the holy sanctuary could not save him from the ghosts for long. The first one he saw again after a brief respite was Lizzie, the dead girl who sometimes appeared in his nightmares. "What? What do you want from me? Go away, do you hear? Go away. We have a gift for you." Lizzie stepped back, pointing to the altar where a translucent silhouette stood. And in those outlines Edward, try as he might, still recognized a familiar figure. "Uncle Frank? Little Eddie, you've been bad. You're a ghost, you're a ghost, you're a ghost. Ghost, ghost," the silhouette echoed, smirking. "You're not real, you're... Lizzie told me everything about you. How naughty you've been, a disobedient, headstrong boy." The ghost started slowly approaching Edward. The blurred details became sharper, and from the mist emerged a face, grinning with huge caterpillar-like lips, shaggy eyebrows sticking out, under which small black eyes nestled, and a tuft of unkempt stiff hair under the nose, a mustache. His uncle, the alpha werewolf, cruel and strong. Edward pushed away the unpleasant memory. "Uncle Frank? That's a lie. I didn't do anything like that." His voice wavered, turning from the rough adult tone to a thin child's falsetto. "Don't lie to me." "No, no, Uncle Frank, no." The dead man drew closer to Edward, slowly unbuckling his belt. "You'll thank me later, kid. I'll make a man out of you, a real werewolf. So why are you standing there? Take off your pants." "It's a dream, a dream." Edward rushed to the side, pressing himself into the corner. "You little brat! Just like last time, running away again." "I killed you, you vile scum. I fought for power. I am a free werewolf," Edward hissed. The ghost paused as if contemplating Edward's words. "Yes, you killed me. I know, little Eddie, I don't blame you for that. Only myself, because I didn't discipline you enough." "Don't be afraid," Frank reassured him, pulling the belt from the loops of his pants. He began to twist it into a tight loop. Light flooded his eyes, blindingly painful. And with it came memories, bitter as wormwood. Or was it a dream? Edward had once forced himself to believe it was just a nightmare, forgotten by morning. But memory had retrieved it from its deepest recesses, cleaned it, refreshed the colors, and spread it across the church floor, as if playing this film for the first time. Uncle Frank holds the belt. The leather belt creaks like a dead man's tendon. Little Eddie with scraped knees. He fought with a classmate. They couldn't share an item they found, an old baseball glove, probably lost by someone or simply thrown away due to numerous holes and wear. "Come here," Uncle Frank says, his voice steely. "They live with Uncle Frank. There's no father. Mother says he is a test pilot and traveler, and now he's flown far north where it's cold to study animals. Uncle Frank claims the father left them, that the wretched mutt doesn't want to live in the pack like the other werewolves. Uncle Frank took them in, but little Eddie doesn't want to live with him." "Come here," Uncle Frank repeats. His eyes are red like a bull's, and he smells of alcohol and wet dog. "What, Uncle Frank?" the boy asks, but doesn't approach. "Come here," Uncle Frank barks. The frightened boy steps closer to him. "What?" Eddie whispers. "Richie's mom called me. You busted his lip? You want other people to find out about us, so they can call us monsters and burn us at the stake?" No. Eddie was surprised. "Don't lie to me." "We just couldn't share the glove," little Eddie whispers, lowering his eyes. "The glove?" Uncle Frank gets more agitated. His voice turns into a hiss. His hands grab the boy. The man begins to transform into a werewolf. "Uncle Frank, let me go!" The boy struggles in the strong arms of the drunken beast, but he doesn't let go. He bares his claws and punishes Edward, painfully, cruelly, as is customary in their pack. No, 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 no. Edward broke into a gallop, running along the church wall, unable to bear the sight of the face he had tried so hard to forget. "Little Eddie, let's have a fight like the old days." "Don't call me that. I killed you. I killed you." The echo of his breaking scream shot up, like an explosion, to the church dome, echoing off the remaining intact windows and stained glass. Edward looked around the hall. The church was empty. Where Lizzie had stood lay only a piece of plaster and piles of dust. Where Frank had stood, the wind whistled through. Edward descended from the altar and nearly stumbled. He twisted his ankle but remained on his feet. The pain cleared his mind. His brain, throbbing with tension, squeezed his eardrums out of his ears. The ghosts had found him even here. Hiding in the church was pointless now. They left, but they would return. It was a matter of minutes. He needed to get out of the church. A realization dawned on him. There was no escaping them. Nowhere. Nothing could stop them. They would always pursue him. I have a gun, Edward thought. In that room, there's a gun with a special bullet. I'll blow my brains out. And Edward laughed, as if he'd heard a good joke. Keys? Where did I throw the keys? Edward looked around, fell to his knees, and started searching the floor for the keys. Where? Where did I throw them? He needed to calm down. Take a breath. The ghosts weren't here yet. Focus and remember. I ran out of the house, ran past the cemetery, saw the abandoned church, went inside, closed the door. There was a rusty lock with a key on the door. I locked the door automatically and threw the key. I need to find it. In the dim moonlight, Edward searched the floor. They must be here somewhere. His hand felt something soft and cloth-like. Edward brought it closer to his face to see and threw it away in disgust. It was a baseball glove. Old, tattered, with the initials EF. A glove from the past. The keys were nowhere to be found. Edward's search grew less fervent as he realized he wouldn't find them. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he stood up and approached the door. He tugged at the heavy lock. Old, maybe older than the church itself, riveted, adorned with a pattern that was hard to make out through the blooming rust. How did it even still work? Maybe it didn't anymore. The moment he locked it was the last straw for the iron mechanism, and it had forever exhausted its reliability, sealing its jaws shut and condemning Edward to eternal imprisonment in the church, alone with the dead. Stepping back a few steps, Edward ran and slammed his shoulder into the door. It merely groaned, clanging against the hinge. Another attempt brought unbearable pain to his shoulder. Kicking the boards didn't work either. The door clanged with the lock, not letting in even a sliver of freedom. Damn it. What kind of curse is this? I'm a werewolf. Why can't I break down the door? Damn ghosts, Edward swore and stepped back. Find the key. Edward turned. The voice was childlike, but not Lizzie's. It belonged to someone standing in the dim light near the holy water font. Squinting, Edward saw familiar clothes on the boy and screamed. His voice was gone. A rasp like barbed wire scorched his throat, spilling out like a dead snake. Standing before him was himself, holding a baseball glove. Only a hint of gray hair and a few scars on his face distinguished adult Edward from his childhood self. He hadn't changed much over the years. I'm not dead yet. You can't be my ghost, Edward rasped, looking at himself as if at a photo taken many years ago and well preserved. Don't be afraid. I'll help you, because I am you. No, Edward laughed. You are not me. And I am not you. I'm still alive. The ghost ignored his laughter. The key is by that wall. Take it. Edward laughed louder. Fits of laughter burst out like spasms. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Just like that. The key is over there. Go and take it. I must be going mad. But where is the relief? Do you want to get out of here? The ghosts won't let you go. But at home, there's a gun and a special bullet. It'll save you. I just want to help you. The key is there. Go and take it. Still chuckling, Edward slowly approached the spot the boy pointed to, knelt down, and began searching for the key, muttering through his laughter. He found it immediately. The cold steel felt good in his hand. Run! They'll be back soon. Very soon. Hurry! Thank you, Edward rasped and ran to the door. He tried to open it frantically. The madness in his eyes was gone. There was a spark of hope. His hands trembled. The key, as if alive, refused to fit into the lock. "Damn it," Edward swore, dropping the key in his nervousness. He picked it up, but before he could try again, a dead man appeared before him, the last of those he had sent to the afterlife. The doctor. His watery eyes stared at Edward. "You dropped something," the ghost said, and handed Edward a handful of keys. They clinked as they fell through his fingers. Edward looked at the floor. It was impossible to tell which key was for the lock on the front door. They were all mixed, turning into a pile of useless metal. A wave of rage washed over his mind. He swung for a punch but couldn't hit. The invisible shackles held his body against the wall. "Do you smoke?" the doctor asked. "What? Do you smoke?" Edward was taken aback by the question, especially from a ghost. "No, I don't." "That's good. Did you know that smoking is one of the leading causes of lung cancer?" "If I knew, I would have smoked. A lot and for a long time. Just not to see all that I've seen here over the last—" Edward paused. How long had he been there? An hour? 2? A day? A week? "Over the last day," the doctor clarified, glancing at his watch. "What do you want to do to me?" Edward asked, looking at his hands that seemed chained to the wall by invisible manacles. "Do you like tea?" The doctor ignored Edward's question. "Go to hell." "I like it. Green tea. Very healthy. I recommend it." "Hey, doctor. Explain to me. What's going on here? Am I insane? Is that it?" "Fortunately, no. My observations suggest with 90% certainty that you're sane." "Sane?" Edward chuckled. "A dead man tells me I'm sane." "Dead because of you." The doctor bared his teeth. "Yes, I killed you. Tore you apart with my claws. So what? Everyone gets what they deserve. You treat people and get paid for it. I kill and eat people and get paid for it too. That's life." "And why did you kill me?" "Personally, I have no grudge against you. I don't care who you are or what you do. An order came in. I fulfilled it. Seek your true killer, the one who wanted you dead. I was just the tool of execution in his hands." "Maybe it's connected to my work?" the doctor asked himself. Behind the doctor, 2 figures appeared in the distance. Edward squinted, trying to make them out. One was Frank. He couldn't remember the other. Familiar features gate, but the face was veiled. "You're a doctor. Who would pay huge sums to kill you?" Edward asked. "Maybe you treated someone poorly and they died? Revenge of relatives? You know, I'm a doctor, but not quite in the field you think. I don't treat people. I worked in a secret government lab, Division N16. They were developing various substances for conducting silent wars. Tanks and gunfire are things of the past. It's much more financially advantageous to wage wars without expensive equipment. Planes, missiles, shells, and without losing human resources. The ideal war. The enemy does all the work for you. You drop a new kind of bacteria into enemy territory, and it devours the enemy from within. Those you want to defeat, in a frenzy of madness, kill themselves. 1, 2 days, and the victor, of course, vaccinated against this infection, enters the city strewn with bodies. The corpses are burned, the streets are disinfected, without a single shot. Isn't it great? And after this, I'm the killer? Doctor, you're scarier than I am? Your hands are stained with the blood of millions? You're naive. It's still in development. Of course, such a weapon hasn't been invented yet. But I'm working on it. Worked on it. Maybe I crossed someone. The figures behind the doctor discussed something among themselves. Frank laughed loudly. His companion patted him on the shoulder, and Edward finally recognized him. It was Brad. "Little Eddie," Frank waved. "Come to us," Brad said, smirking. "Are those your friends?" the doctor asked, turning around. "They're my nightmares. Little Eddie, we have a surprise for you. Look." Frank pointed to the side, and there, as if by magic, appeared a butcher's table. And on it, Edward couldn't bear to look. "Why are you turning away, Eddie? Your friend Brad has a gift for you." On the table, in a similar pose to Edward's current one, lay a child, a boy, the one everyone used to call just Eddie. "I'll cut off his head," Frank roared, pulling a crooked knife from its sheath. "Wait, let's enjoy his pain first." Brad knew his job. A scalpel gleamed in his hands. "Don't touch him. Come to me," Edward shouted. "We'll definitely come to you, don't worry." "Go away!" Edward yanked once more. Something cracked in his wrist. Burning pain seared his left hand. The shackles gave way, freeing his path. With a mad cry, he ran towards the maniacs, but a light draft blew away the mirage. No one was there. The dust raised squeaked on his teeth. Edward collapsed to the floor. The throbbing pain in his hand grew, and he realized with horror that it was broken. His wrist was swollen, aching like a rotten tooth, sending explosive pain with the slightest movement. "I am you. You." The belated echo echoed through the church's arches. Edward shivered at the sound of the voice, shouted a few curse words to drown it out. The words, like birds that had flown into a room, flapped frantically against the walls. They landed again on his prematurely gray, now snow-white head. There were no more thoughts. He had crossed the threshold beyond which nothing mattered anymore. It seemed that even the pain wouldn't bring him back. Tranquility, like cotton wool, enveloped him. The white oblivion plunged him into the warmth of emptiness. He was neither falling asleep nor fainting. He was simply lying somewhere in another reality. He wanted to stop breathing, so as not to hear the annoying wheeze. And his heart. It was still beating, knocking the silence out from under him. The heartbeat brought him back to this reality, where he lay, completely gray, with a broken wrist, in pants wet with urine, exhausted on the damp, moldy floor of an abandoned church, in a place where God had left and where he had hidden, hoping to find salvation. Salvation had flicked its tail, offering false hope. Time became his main enemy. Under the statues, in a wheelchair, sat an old woman. Her gray hair spread across her shoulders. She was whispering something, praying. Close your eyes and ears, and hide as far away as possible, in the farthest corner, to neither see nor hear what was unfolding before him. Edward couldn't do it. Either his body wouldn't obey him, or some part of him didn't want to. He stared at the old woman, unable to look away. Her frail, dry hands rested on the gray blanket covering her legs. Gnarled, arthritic fingers trembled. She was dressed very strangely. A clearly men's shirt, resembling a prisoner's uniform without pockets or buttons, only Velcro. On her chest, Edward made out a patch, County Psychiatric Hospital, and below that, crudely written in permanent marker, Anna Forster. "Mom?" Edward asked, astonished, approaching the old woman. She raised her head and looked at him with cataract-clouded eyes. "Beans for lunch again today. I hate beans. Leave me alone." "Mom," Edward called again. "That young nurse is stealing my things. I know it. She gives me pills and steals. Cut off her head." "Mom, it's me. Edward, your son." The old woman looked intently at the figure standing before her. "Edward?" she repeated. "Yes, I remember. The birth was difficult. The doctor said they had to cut off my arm. I refused. Do you understand? I was under hypnosis. He gave me an injection and I couldn't move. and he kept coming on to me. He extracted the fetus with iron forceps. The old woman was mad. Edward recoiled from her, but guilt wouldn't let him leave. He had fled from his mother that ill-fated day when Frank's life ended. He ran because he didn't know what to say to her when she saw the beheaded body of their relative. And he never saw her again. He lived for a month near his childhood home in basements and sewers, once even sneaking in through a window for food during the day when no one was home. But he never saw his mother. He didn't want to see her. He was afraid. And then living there where everything reminded him of those events became unbearable. So he left, hitchhiking north. He was good at lying. Made up stories about visiting a sick father or a school bus breaking down on a picnic. And he got lost after wandering too far from the group. People believed him and helped. Some even gave him money. "You're not here. It means you're still alive, silly boy," said the old woman. And her voice, which had been creaky with age, turned into that familiar voice he hadn't heard in 30 years. His heart ached. Exhaustion fell on him like a heavy sack. Edward sank to the floor and began to cry, bitterly, desperately, trying to weep away all the sins he had committed. The moan poured out, breaking into a scream and a howl. It didn't take a genius to understand what had happened to his mother after his escape. It came to him like a revelation. She returned from work, exhausted from monotonous hard labor. Her shoulders ached. Her back was sore. The door was unlocked. And that scared her. Frank drank a lot, and little Edward was too young. Bad people could have broken in. But what she saw when she entered the house and the unusual silence cut her ears, forever changed her life. Frank's room was covered in blood. The walls, the bed, the floor. Everything was drenched in dark, dried blood. And on the bed, one leg hanging over the floor as if about to get up, lay dead Frank, headless. Anna wanted to scream, but her breath was taken away by wild animal fear and revulsion. The severed head lay on the floor like a curled up and sleeping cat, the glossy black circle of the neck's cut. Dried blood splatters forming horrible hieroglyphs of death on the walls. At that moment, something irreversible happened. Her sense of reality forever changed. In her head, it was like a switch had clicked. Someone turned off the light, then turned it back on, but it shone differently. She fainted beside the head, face to face with the one she had secretly hated, but never allowed herself to think about his death. Frank had saved them, given them shelter. When she came to, the first thing she saw was him, his head. She remembered nothing after that. Consciousness returned to her in fragments. A hospital room, an investigator asking her something, slapping her face, while the orderly looked away in shame, trying not to notice. Then a saving void. The eternal prisoners of their minds, the mad, the violent, attacking the orderlies, biting their own flesh and the quiet ones, monotonously mumbling nonsense in the corners of the corridor. Lunch. An orderly with a syringe. God, how she hated injections since childhood. And again the void. Someone's cries, mad, desperate. Someone being beaten with sticks. Night. Full moon. It would be restless again tonight. The black, viscous dream would be filled with nightmares. Horrible, frightening, making her jump out of bed and scream. But she had to hold back the scream. Orderlies always came at the sound of screams and gave injections. After injections, waking up was impossible, and the sleep lasted forever. Outside the window, spring quickly turned into summer. Summer heated the walls and left. Autumn poured acid on the trees, causing them to shed and contort, and the century-old winter began. Little Eddie, your mother rotted in a mental hospital. And it was you who put her there, Frank shouted joyfully, baring sharp teeth. No, Edward whispered, looking into the mad eyes of the old woman. Yes, my boy, yes. Look at her. Frank approached the old woman, gently adjusted the blanket on her lap, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She waited for you, Edward. Hoped you would come and take her away. Frank checked the sharpness of the knife with his finger. And you abandoned her. Alone. Little Eddie, look here. Edward squeezed his eyes shut, covered his ears with his hands. Stupid boy. Behaved badly and now wants to avoid punishment. How disgraceful. Little Eddie, you abandoned your pack. And look what happened to your mother. Uncle turned into a werewolf and struck Edward forcefully. The last thing Edward remembered was the dull sound of a head rolling away, like a bowling ball thrown accurately at the pins. Tearing the eyelids of unconsciousness, the first thing he felt was the taste of copper on his lips. It took no more than 2 seconds, which felt like hours to realize it was blood. Opening his eyes and looking around, he felt a wave of shock engulf his mind, causing nauseous reflexes and weakness throughout his body. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, on the statues. Everything was splattered with red. Edward sat up, and a second wave of revulsion hit him, forcing him to use all his strength to hold back the vomit that was bursting out. Nearby lay bloody, battered baseball gloves. Come to us, a familiar voice sounded. Edward looked towards the end of the hall. There, by the altar, stood a human figure. Obeying the command without question, Edward moved towards it, leaving bloody streaks behind. You are tired, my son, said the figure standing before him. Father, Edward exhaled. Yes, my son. I am tired. We will take you. Tears rolled down Edward's cheeks. Dad, you left us. I don't even know what you look like. The figure before him smiled. He couldn't see the smile because it was impossible to see it on the smooth, faceless oval that was its head. But Edward felt his father smile. Dad, why are they haunting me? You know the answer, son? They're driving me insane. Calm down, son. It's over. I came for you. We came for you, said his mother. Came for you, echoed disjointed voices from all sides. The dead, all those he had killed, the doctor, Brad, Lizzie, Frank, and thousands of faces he no longer remembered, stood along the walls of the church, and their pale white silhouettes made it seem as if everything around was covered in snow. Edward smiled. You came for me? Then take me. And the dead moved towards him, surrounding him in a tight ring of death. A piercing scream rose to the church's dome, turning into a rasping whisper. Then silence fell. Part 2. The Diary. November 9th, 1995. My sick imagination draws living pictures for me. Zombies, gnawed, half-decayed corpses, the dead rising from their graves. Funny. And what then? Even God doesn't know. Ah, what God? There is no God. I proved that. The wounds are healing. My fingers are already bending. My pinky finger was less fortunate. The tendons were damaged and now it's useless. I can't move it. But that's nothing. The main thing is I managed to get the reagents. Where they dripped when I carelessly opened them, there are festering sores that won't heal. I need to be more careful. November 10th, 1995. The preparation took much more time than I expected. But I have only one chance, so it's better not to rush. A mistake means defeat. There's too much at stake. I'm waiting for the leaching process to finish. November 12th, 1995. I walked around the city a lot. I still can't get used to so many people. It seems like everyone is looking only at me. Herd creatures, they live by the principle of us versus them. They make me sick. In my coat pocket, I clutched a revolver. It took all my restraint not to pull it out and start shooting into the faces of the first people I saw. The world became empty without you, Father. November 17th, 1995. Father made my job easier. Everything in his diaries, all his notes about T4, he didn't encrypt. Although he had a penchant for such things, his personal diary is entirely written in hieroglyphs. But I deciphered them. Back in my youth. Heredity, intelligence. Father would have been proud of me, after he scolded and whipped me with a belt. Moreover, part of the ingredients was in the home lab. But there was still work to be done. To get vanadium oxide, I had to sacrifice a pinky finger and a festering rib. November 19th, 1995. From Father's notes. After administering T4 orally in a dose of 0.05 milliliters to the test subject, the following symptoms are observed. Increased body temperature, up to 38 degrees C, sweating, nervousness. Auditory hallucinations appear. Increasing the dose to 0.07 milliliters causes severe visual and auditory hallucinations. Speech remains unimpaired. Aggression alternates with severe fear attacks. After 30 minutes, symptoms of severe mental damage appear. All the subject's attempts result in suicide. How wonderful. Just what I need. This monster cannot be killed with ordinary weapons. I must be careful. Werewolves exist, and one of them killed my father. November 21st, 1995. The final stage of my revenge is approaching. How long I've waited. This beast will pay for my father's death. I searched for it. Searched for a long time. Spent all my savings, bribed people. Killed. The thread led me to someone named Tony. What a freak he is. He didn't take the money. Well, worse for him. The number of cut-off fingers is directly proportional to the truth you want to know. Tony needed 5. His death was quick. He didn't suffer. But I learned all the details. It's very close. Very close. November 25th, 1995. The hour has come. Today, revenge will be fulfilled. Ah, this cold dish, and I will savor it to the last crumb. And then I'll put a bullet in my temple. Father, soon. I'm coming to you. Part 3. The next morning. It wasn't crowded near the abandoned church. 2 medical examiners and a police officer were questioning the terrified witnesses. 2 teenagers no older than 15. Officer Campton got out of the car, inhaled the cold morning air through his nostrils, and yawned widely. The approaching assistant also wasn't fully awake. He looked disheveled and smelled of booze. "What do we have?" Campton asked, rubbing his eyes and turning his nose away from the assistant. "A man's body. The teenagers found him in the church when they came to play there." Playing in a church? Campton was surprised. "Youth. New generation. Different morals," sighed the assistant, licking his dry, chapped lips. "Any theories?" Campton asked. The man shrugged, handing him a sheet of paper. The preliminary examination report prepared by the medical examiner. The officer took the report, skimmed it, found the needed section, and read aloud. Presumably, death occurred from strangulation. Marks of fingers with 8 oval shapes are visible on the neck. Near the left carotid artery, against the background of the bruise, arcuate strip-like abrasions from nails are visible. Looking expressively at the bustling medical examiner nearby, he loudly asked, "What does this even mean? Can't you write in plain language?" "If to convey the general meaning." The assistant adjusted his glasses that had slid down his nose. "The death occurred from suffocation. He strangled himself. Is that even possible? The medical examiner must have made a mistake. It's impossible to strangle oneself, of course." The officer looked at the body. The dead man's face was twisted in a grimace of terror. His hands clutched his own neck with such fury that blue veins stood out. Did the man strangle himself? Campton shook his head, cursing the inept staff under his breath. "Officer Campton!" another policeman shouted, running out from the underbrush and waving his hands. "We've got another body. Behind the church, in the bushes. Suicide, shot himself." Officer Campton sighed heavily. The new day wasn't starting off well.